What's up, Dan? Is that the Antec P30 AIR? Yes, sir. We going to jump into the case details? No, but we're going to do things a little bit different this time around. Let's go over all of the case features as we continue on with the build. Let's get into it. So this is the Antec P30, and there's actually two different versions available for the P30. There's the P30 AIR, which we have today, and it has 5 pre-installed non-RGB fans. And there's also the P30 ARGB, which has the same amount of pre-installed fans, but the front 2 and the rear fan are ARGB. So we have the P30 AIR, and we're gonna be doing a blacked out build, and we'll discuss more on the fans once we get to the inside of the case. But taking a look at the exterior, it's very simple, but looks really clean, and it's definitely set up for some very high airflow. We have this wood accent right here, which definitely seems to be the trend in PC cases nowadays. And myself, I think it looks great. I think it looks really classy. And then if we take a look at the front, we've got a mesh panel, and that kind of continues down to here. You can see, we can see all the way through. And then if we go to the side right here, this is all mesh as well. And then we have these really interesting looking feet on the bottom, and then a nice elevated base to get fresh air into the bottom of the chassis. Then if we take a look at the top, we've got mesh up here, and this is actually a magnetic dust filter, so you can take this off and clean it when you need to. And then when this is off, we can access the top right here for your fans or your radiator or both. So let's go ahead and put this back into place for right now. And here's all of our IO. We've got our power button, what I assume is a reset button, but I'll have to see once the build's done. We have an audio jack, we have 2 USB Type A 3.0, and then we have a USB-C 3.2 Gen 2 for 10 gigabit per second. So we have some nice IO at the top. The back panel is actually completely solid. There's no mesh on the back right here, which is probably not needed for how everything is going to be oriented in this case. And then if we take a look at the rear, we have ventilation for our rear fan. Motherboard's going to sit right here. We have our PCIe slot covers, and then our power supply is going to sit horizontal down at the bottom. But let's go ahead and take off all these panels, and then we'll start talking about the inside. And all of these panels are toolless removal. They all just pretty much just pop off. And I think the back panel actually has 2 captive screws. So I'm just gonna go ahead and take these off behind the scenes, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the inside. So taking a look at the inside of the case and the pre-installed fans, we have 2 blacked out 140 millimeter fans on the front for intake. We have 2 blacked out 120 millimeter reverse blade fans on the bottom for intake. And then we have a blacked out 120 millimeter fan on the rear for exhaust. And you may be wondering why there isn't a fan right here. Well, positioned below this panel is the power supply, so there's not much room for a fan here to get fresh air. So Antec decided just to leave it out, and they just smoothed the section out right here. But we do have these 2 fans, which are going to help greatly with our GPU temperatures, and there's mesh below these fans so they can get a lot of fresh air from the bottom, and then also the side right here. And this case can support up to ATX motherboards. You can fit up to a 360 millimeter radiator at the top. We have a bunch of grommets for cable management going all around the motherboard tray right here. And there's also some pass-throughs down here for all of our cable management. So it should be really easy to build in. Looks like there's a lot of room, but let's go ahead and take a look at the rear of the case. So we have a drive caddy down here for different types of drives. I believe you can fit 2 HDDs on it, or you can fit 1 HDD and an SSD. And I'm sorry, it's a little bit dark right there, but there is a little drive cage right there. And then you can also fit a 2.5 inch drive over here as well. And then we've got all of our cabling over here, which includes all of our top IO. So those are all coming down here. And then all of our fan cables are also right here. So we're gonna definitely have to clean those up and make it look really nice. So on that front, I think we should just go ahead and jump into the cable management and getting all of our fan cables and the IO cables ready for our motherboard and the rest of the components. So our preliminary cable management is all done. It actually looks way better. We basically only got all of our top IO cables right here, and I've got them all nice and bundled together, and then we'll have to route those all nicely once the motherboard is in. And then as far as all the fan cables, I pretty much routed them all towards the front. You can kind of see we have a spaghetti of cables, but we've got our rear fans kind of dangled over right here. Our front fans, I ended up routing the cables down here. So this fan goes right here, this fan goes right here, and it's gonna be hard to show on camera, but there's a little pass through right here. So I fed the cables going right here through there, and those are now sitting right here. And then what I'm gonna do is once the motherboard's installed, I'll get those all connected, and then we're gonna zip tie all those cables together, and we're gonna hide those behind these bottom fans right now. And once the GPU is in, you will never see those cables, and then it's gonna make for a much cleaner back end. And then one other thing I did is I actually rotated the rear fan. The cable originally came out on this side, but I have it routed down here, and this is gonna go right here and kind of go along and down with our motherboard and then plug into the fan header, and it's gonna look really clean, and we're not gonna see a cable up at the top right here. So it'll be nice and tidy as always, but I think it's time to get to putting together the motherboard and installing it. Okay, so the motherboard has been assembled. We've got a 7800X3D, and that's gonna be cooled by the Sudoku digital air coolers. This is the SK700V, and it does have a digital display on there. We've got 32 gigabytes of Team Group T-Create RAM over here, and we have a 2 terabyte NVMe under this heatsink right here. And then the only two connections for the cooler, I have the fan connection hooked up to our CPU fan right there. And there's also a USB connection coming off the air cooler for the digital display. And I actually have that routed right here, and I have it routed underneath this heatsink. You can see the cable is right here. So this is a cable management trick I like to do. I have all the cabling under here, and you can see the cable pops out right there. So I have the excess cable hidden underneath this heatsink, which makes it look really clean. But let's go ahead and get this installed in the case. So our motherboard is installed. We've got all of our pre-installed fans hooked up, and then we've also got all of our I/O connections hooked up as well. So let's take a look at the back first. So all of our IO cables are over here, and these are zip tied, and I'm probably gonna clean these up a little bit more once we get our power supply installed, but I've got USB-C. I've got all of the IO connections like the power button and reset going through here, as well as USB-A and also HD audio. So right now it's looking really clean, and we have no fan connections back here. But if we look along the front and we look down here, it's gonna be really hard to show, but I have the bundle of cables zip tied back there. So it is much cleaner in the front. And then once the GPU is installed, you won't be able to see any of those at all. The only cable you can really see is this HD audio cable over here. And once the GPU is installed, like I said, that will probably disappear, or I can clean that up even more so it looks really clean, guys. We still do have to get the top fans installed. We've got to get the power supply installed, but we're actually getting really close. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. So the power supply is installed, and pretty much all of our cables for the power supply are hooked up except our GPU cable because it's not quite installed. But we've got our CPU cables going right here, and I'm not fully sure I like how this looks. I mean, it's not bad, but during the montage, I had them tucked under this section of the case, so I may go back to that. We shall see. And then we've got our 24-pin cable right here, and it's plugged into the motherboard on the other side. And then all those cables are pretty much sitting in front of our IO cables. And then you can see our IO cables are branching off to their respective part of the motherboard. Then all the cables come down and then plug into the power supply. And then our GPU cables are loose because it is not installed yet, but it is looking really, really clean. And then if we take a look at the front side of the case, nothing has pretty much changed except our CPU cables are plugged into the top left of the motherboard. We have our 24-pin right there, and then our GPU cable is loose. And then earlier I said we're going to be installing some fans at the top, but we're pretty much only going to install one fan because for an air-cooled build, I pretty much only want an exhaust fan as far left as we can get it, because if you had two exhaust fans right here, all of that fresh air that comes in from the front is immediately exhausted out the top, and then we starve our air cooler fan. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna install one exhaust over here, and then I'm gonna leave these empty. But if you did wanna run 3 fans at the top, I'd recommend 2 intake. So one right here, and then an exhaust over here. That way our air cooler fan is gonna get a ton of fresh air. So let's go ahead and get that fan installed, and then we'll get the GPU installed, and then we're pretty much done. All right, guys, so the build is all done and it looks absolutely incredible. I've gotten so many comments lately about when I'm gonna do another blacked out build. Well, here is one in all of its glory and it looks absolutely fantastic. I think this blacked out air-cooled build will pretty much go with any desk aesthetic that you have, whether it be white, whether it be black, or any other kind of color. I think this will look extremely classy, especially with this wood aesthetic right here. And then if we look through the 4mm tempered glass, we can see our digital air cooler showing us all of our CPU vitals, because me personally, I like to keep track of all my vitals when I'm gaming or doing other tasks. So I think that looks really cool. And even with that dark tinted glass, we can still see all of our vitals. So if you guys were going with an Antec P30 case, do you think you'd go for the Air version? and black it out like I did? Or do you think you'd go for the ARGB version and have a bunch of RGB components inside? Let me know down in the comments, but let's go ahead and take off all these panels and then take a look at the inside. So just in case you skipped over the montage where I mentioned the majority of the components inside, let's go over them again. So we're using a Ryzen 7800X3D CPU, and that's being cooled by this Sudoku SK700V digital air cooler, which has a digital readout for all of our CPU vitals. We've got a Gigabyte B850 motherboard. We've got 32 gigabytes of Team Group T-Create RAM, which is unfortunately really expensive right now due to the memory shortage. So hopefully that's sorted out sooner than later. And then we've got a 2 terabyte SN850X by WD Black underneath this GPU right here. And then speaking of the GPU, it is a Palette Gaming Pro OC5070, which looks great. We're using all of the pre-installed fans that Antec supplied. So we've got two 140mm in the front. We've got two reverse blade 120mm on the bottom, a 120mm fan on the rear, and then I installed a Noctua 120mm fan on the top as exhaust. So in total, we have two intake on the front, two intake on the bottom, and then an exhaust on the rear and the top. And like I mentioned during the montage, that is a very good setup for air coolers. But if you did want to install more fans at the top, I would leave this fan as exhaust, and then I would have an intake right here and then an intake right here. So our air cooler can get a bunch of fresh air, because if you did exhaust right here, then you would have all of the fresh air from the front fans exhaust immediately, and then we would kind of starve our air cooler fan of fresh air. So make sure you run those as intake if you're planning on running 3 fans at the top. So this build is really clean, guys. And a few specs I didn't go over earlier for the case: you can fit air coolers with a height of up to 175 millimeters. So you can see we've got this gigantic air cooler in here, and it fits perfectly fine. And then for GPUs, you can fit a max length of up to 405 millimeters. And this is a really big 5070, and you can see we still have plenty of room for an even bigger GPU. So really clean build, really nice specs. But let's go ahead and take a look at the rear now. Make sure my power cable doesn't come out. So we're using a Strix 1000 watt power supply, and then I'm using the cables that it comes with. And then here is the cable management, and it looks absolutely incredible, and it's definitely up to the Dankamyouknow standards. We've got our CPU cable right here, and that's coming down over here, and then we've got everything kind of bunched up right here, and then we've got our 24 pin going to the motherboard right here. We've got all of our IO cables kind of branched out right here and going to the motherboard. Then everything else is coming down, and then our GPU cable is kind of stuffed under here and then zip tied all together. And then there's a pass through right here where my fingers are, and that's where the GPU cable is routed. So really clean cable management, guys. It was also really easy to cable management. Really easy to cable manage. I didn't really run into any hiccups, really smooth sailing. And like I said earlier, all of our fan cables are routed towards the front and pretty much hidden behind the bottom fans. So really, really clean. And if you guys have seen my channel before, I pretty much focus the majority of my effort on the cable management, and this one was really easy. So really clean build, guys. Absolutely love it. And then as far as the build process, this case was super easy to build in. With all of the pre-installed fans, it makes everything so much easier, because you pretty much just have to prep the motherboard, get it installed, hook up all of your IO cables, your fan cables, and then you've got your power supply, and then you've got your GPU, and then you're done. So if you're a first-time builder and you're looking at this case, I think it's a great choice, and it's really easy to build in. Or if you're an experienced builder, you'll definitely have no issues building in this case. So there's a lot of options for different builds. It's really easy to build in. It's very, very high airflow. The temps in here are absolutely fantastic. So if you're in the market for a case like this, I would definitely recommend checking it out. And let me know what you guys think of the build down in the comments. And like I mentioned earlier, do you think you'd go for the P30 AIR, or do you think you'd go for the P30 ARGB? Let me know, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've got to admit, the build is looking mean. I definitely agree with you there, Dan. If you want to check out the Antec P30 AIR case or anything else used in this video, I'll have it linked in the description, in the pinned comment, and also in my bio. Once again, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like if you enjoyed it, share it with your friends, comment below what you think, and then I'll see y'all in the next video.